We have arrived at nonverbal communication. What we're going to talk about in this chapter is, of course, nonverbal communication, the principles, communication through body movement, proxemics, paralanguage. Paralanguage we've talked about somewhat, so you have an idea of where we're going with that. Symbols and nonverbal communication, functions of nonverbal communication, and violations of nonverbal communication. These are the principles of nonverbal communication, and if you don't like them, I got more. Anyway, here we are. It has multiple channels. In other words, our face, our expressions, our hand movement, if we're close or far from a person, all these are multiple channels in which we're giving feedback non-verbally. It's more ambiguous. It's more open to the interpretation of the person receiving than common spoken language, because we're not using the symbols of words. It can be more ambiguous. It has fewer rules. It's not a dictionary of nonverbal. It's more of based on experiences and our interaction with the person. It has more meaning. There's paralanguage in there, which we've talked about, which could be the tone, it could be the volume, it could be the speed, it could be all those things rolled into it. And it can be mixed messages, where if our nonverbals aren't matching our verbal communication, we're mixing up those messages. It can be influenced by culture, family, sphere of influence, in-groups, out-groups. All these things can impact. And it can also be influenced by cultural roles of gender or of how people view each other within the society. So hopefully you've gone over and you watched the TED Talk on mind reading. That's where this comes in. If we can figure out our own style and we can figure out the style of others, it's not going to be a case of trying to manipulate. It's more of a case of finding the proper words to be heard for the context to come across. So if you haven't watched it, run over there, look at the Think and Respond one on mind reading, and it will tell you if you're a looker, a listener, or a toucher. Myself, I'm a looker. However, don't forget, this is more about like a dominant hand versus a non-dominant hand. So I do have aspects of being a listener and a toucher too, and it can be situational, where if I'm down, a hug does help more than just saying, do you see what I'm saying? So realize that this is about a dominant type of listening style versus a non-dominant. We said there wasn't a whole lot of rules that govern nonverbal communication, but there are certain codes that seem to kind of dictate our nonverbal communication. Facial expressions. When you're happy, you smile. When you're sad, you frown. When you're concerned, you have the eyebrow up, and etc. So we do have kind of an expected response that we see associated with feelings. Eye contact. This can also be a cultural thing. In some cultures, it's not respectful to make eye contact with your elders. So those people don't make eye contact. In other cultures, you're expected to look people in the eyes. And so that goes back to our cultural learning and understanding what people expect. Gestures. Gestures. Crossed arms versus open hands versus come here, go over there. All these are illustrators, regulators, adapters. If you don't want a person too close, you go, whoa, and you kind of put up that barrier. That is a regulator. And you have to understand, this can also be culturally based. So in some cultures, you might go, hey, thumbs up. In other cultures, you might be saying something completely different. So you have to watch with gestures if it's going to be positive or negative. Posture. You always hear, sit up straight, look forward, chin up, all those type of things. Posture can also indicate, because when we think of a person that is in a good mood or they're kind of in charge, they're always big, they're always open. Meanwhile, if we think of a person that's depressed or sullen, they're kind of drawn in, downward. So posture can be tied into our nonverbal communication. Communication through touch or haptics. Touch can be very important to us, and it's something that probably is really changing right now within our society based on COVID. Once it was a, professional handshake. A good strong handshake was the way you introduced yourself here in Colorado or in Western states or many places. A strong handshake. That's professional touch. It may not be appropriate soon. A social polite touch, once again, it might be a pat on the back, for doing a good job. Friendship, warmth, a hug. Love, intimacy, a longer hug, a kiss. Sexual arousal is another function of touch. Aggressive, hostile, of course we know what that is, don't need to go into that. It can also be influenced by gender roles that we have within society. It can be influenced by social influences. In other words, if you've ever been part of a theater group, everybody hugs. You greet someone, you hug. It's different. But if you take that person out of the theater group and you put them into a law office, you're probably not going to be greeting people with hugs. And there are cultural influences. So all touch has a nonverbal communication, has all these multiple elements. And it's kind of important to remember where you are and what the situation is and realize that they are dynamic and they do change, because a lot of our touch communication isn't going to be effective now that we're told to be 6 feet apart and now that we're doing social distancing. So it's going to become a dynamic change. This was the model that oftentimes we saw. We have our intimate space, our personal space, our social space, our public space, our territorial space, are influenced once again by social gender roles, by social influences, and by culture. Public space, more than 12 feet. In other words, if you're in public, you don't really need to be close to someone, so it was kind of, more space felt better. Social distance. Well, now we would say 6 feet, but it was once considered 4 to 12. In other words, if you go into an office and you're socially interacting with people, or you're going into a party and you're socially interacting with them, you're normally within 4 to 12 feet of them. Personal space. That's when someone gets in close, gets within that 4 feet. And this can cause an awkward feeling if it's a person you don't know well, or it's a person that you're not comfortable with being in your personal space. And intimate space is the less than 18 inches, and those are the people that in your sphere of influence are close. Family, maybe a spouse, maybe a significant person in your life, you allow them into the intimate space. Now, we also have communication that goes beyond. What we were just talking about was what's called proxemics, and it's the distance. So in other words, if I want to get more connected to someone, I'll move in closer. If I want to pull back, I move physically away from them. Another way I communicate is through personal appearance. And we know this. I mean, if you're going to a rock concert or a country concert, well, the rock concert, you're probably going to wear blue jeans, and you might wear blue jeans to the country concert. But the cowboy hat probably isn't going to carry over in the rock concert. Maybe a baseball cap there and a cowboy hat in the other one. So we start to identify certain aspects of it based on our personal appearance. And we do this purposely, and we also do it unintentionally. Sometimes when we're in a rush to get out the door, we just throw on whatever we got, and we run out the door, and we're at the store in our pajamas. That doesn't say a whole lot of great about us, but if we show up and we're dressed nice, then it says something different. So clothing can actually impact our communication. Hygiene, social influences, cultural influences all play into it. Like I said, if you want to look at this, if you were taking a public speaking course, They would say you want to be on the professional attire, such as the grooming, the no earrings, maybe no beard. All these things tie more into aspects of it. Now, this one breaks it down to, yeah, earrings in a male doesn't really have an influence now within our society, but 30 years ago, a guy wearing an earring might have an influence on how they are being interpreted. We also communicate through the symbols. We have symbols of office. Take, for instance, a judge in a court. Now, when you walk into a courtroom, they have a gavel, they have this big desk, and they're wearing these robes. Now, on the other hand, if they walk out into the street, the gavel and the robes will identify them as a judge. We also find this with chefs. We find this in any type of uniform where it creates a symbol for the office. It can also be a display of wealth or poverty. And sometimes it can be confusing because as we saw the internet boom come up, you ended up with kind of people that didn't dress the traditional business role. You know, they had their t-shirt and they had their blue jeans and they had their sandals on, and that was the owner of the company. And so we can see it changes, but you do notice that when we were talking about trying to keep up with other people and that we basically, you know, hey, our neighbor bought a car, so I need to buy a car type of thing. Group affiliation can also be found. Go to any sporting event. You automatically know who the home team is by who has the most jerseys being worn out in the parking lot. There can also be communication through environment. That's the reason why you're seeing like banks, they're changing. They're changing their environment because they're trying to change the nonverbal communication. So if you go in there and suddenly there's a coffee shop where you thought your bank was, but it's still the bank, it's because they're trying to change their nonverbal communication, trying to make it more welcoming, less cold. You see this in classrooms, you see it in courtrooms, in labs. I mean, you don't want to think about a lab not being all nice and clean and beakers and all this stuff. It's what you expect. So they're communicating, it's a lab, through part of its appearance. Business offices. Like I said, businesses will change how they appear in order to change the nonverbal message that they're sending. If you ever really want to be bored, go ahead and look up on YouTube, and I know you can find videos that talk about how restaurants, fast food restaurants, actually are made to make us feel like we need to move out and get going because they want to circulate as much business as possible. So of course the chairs are plastic and uncomfortable. And of course you go through a maze to get to the counter because that gets the flowing going. So it can be manipulated in order to create a nonverbal message that you may be perceiving or might not be perceiving. What are the functions of nonverbal communication? We want to express emotion through our nonverbals. When we're saying sometimes we cannot capture something through words alone, that's where nonverbal can find that next plateau. Like when we're talking about disgusting. Well, you can say the word disgusting, but ooh, disgusting. Suddenly that nonverbal aspect of repulsion added in with the disgusting, boom, suddenly it creates more of a sharing of that emotion. Smiles, tears, laughter, all those convey emotions in a nonverbal fashion. They can convey meaning, you know, and you see this with storytellers a lot of times where they're like, oh no, I caught a big fish. Suddenly, through that nonverbal motion, they've conveyed a different meaning. You might think a big fish is this. No, I'm talking big fish. Presenting self, especially when we're talking about the uniforms that we wear or how we dress, how we're presenting ourselves through that method is very much so. I mean, I could be sitting here in an old torn up t-shirt and giving you the same information, but instead every time I come down to record, I make sure I have a button-up shirt and I look like I would in the classroom. rather than showing up in my flip-flops and pajamas, which many of us have gotten into the tendency of since we've started the social distancing. Managing interactions. Once again, when you're at that sporting event, you're going to manage your interactions by wearing that team jersey. If you show up at the New York Jets game wearing a Patriots hat, you're managing interactions because those Jets fans will not talk to you, and if they do, it may not be in a positive fashion. On the other hand, you run into other Patriot fans, you'll identify each other, and we're managing interactions based on how we're non-verbally communicating. Defining relationships. Holding hands when you're walking. Being close to each other at a dinner table. All those little things that create intimacy between two people is defining their relation. Or if you refuse to stand next to someone, that as well is defining a relationship. Dominance can also be utilized through nonverbal communication. And you oftentimes see that where a person, if they're not dominant, they're going to be kind of drawn in. And meanwhile, the dominant person's out there and just kind of on big. And for that reason, all of these are nonverbal communication functions. Now, there are violations. Yes, I have to bring that up. But they can be positive or they can be negative. And it's all based on the perception of the person involved. And it's all based on the level of intimacy, and it's all based on the sphere of influence. And in many ways, violations tell us truly more about a relationship than not. Now, let's talk about this. Is touch positive or negative violation? What about how you appear? Can that be a negative violation? Space, can that be a negative violation? Can it be a positive violation? And the answer is yes to all those. They can be both. Now, when we're talking about touch as a positive violation, when you accidentally hold someone's hand and they hold your hand back, that's a positive violation. Normally, we don't go around holding all of everyone's hands, but when they respond, then that's the case. It becomes a positive one. When you dress a certain way and you've put on that team jersey and you're going out to that sport, and for some people, it's going to be a negative violation. You're showing up in the other team's jersey. Some people, it's a positive violation. Oh, you rebel, you're in the other team's jersey. Space, when you're too close, standing in someone's intimate space, but you don't intend on, normally what that causes is the person steps back or moves away. But if the person moves closer, then that violation becomes a positive violation. So once again, it's a dynamic process in which negative or positive is drawn upon based on our experiences and our expectations of others and where we want the relationship to go. So this was a chapter. I kept it under 20 minutes. I know you got 60-minute of videos to watch this time. Hang in there. This is one of the busy weeks, but make sure you're responding down below and giving some feedback on each of these, because we covered a lot. We covered nonverbal communication, the principles, communication through body movement, paralanguage, proxemics, symbols and nonverbal, functions of nonverbal, and positive and negative violations. Look forward to seeing your comments after this, and we'll get through this week. Got another week coming up, and we're moving into the really cool stuff.